Get started here. Okay, today is October 13th, and this is our first live meeting for English composition, logic, and rhetoric. That topic is obviously very broad, and our goal during this meeting time is just to continuously work on all the skills that we need to develop to be able ultimately to write well. But writing is really not that important. In order to write well, we've got to learn a lot of other things first. If you struggle to write, it's not because you don't know how to write. It's because you probably have other problems that just become obvious when you try to write. When you try to write, if you're not able to think well, if you're not able to reason well, if you don't have experience that applies to a topic, it doesn't matter how many writing classes you take, you're not going to be able to write well. So in order to become a better writer, you don't need to sit around practicing writing all the time. You need to learn those other skills that are drawn upon when we write. So what we're going to do in these live classes is work on all these other things. Let me ask you a couple questions to get started here. For those of you who have studied grammar, and I'm talking like elementary grammar, so I'm not talking Latin or Greek. What is written language? Does anyone remember what is written language? So we talk about writing and composition. What is written language? Who can answer that for me? And if you don't know a specific lesson that I'm referring to, you can take a guess. What is written language? What is writing? Henry says speech that is written. Yeah, so I want you to focus on that. I want you to focus on what Henry wrote there, speech that is written, okay? So speech comes before writing. We speak every day. Think of your daily life. You spend almost the entire day speaking. And you've done that your whole life. When you're a toddler, you're already speaking. 5 years old, you're already speaking. Every day you're speaking, speaking, speaking. You write very little compared to how much time you spend speaking. Speaking is very easy. It's very comfortable. It's very fast. Writing is often very difficult. And there's a reason for that, which we'll talk about. So in order to write well, do you think a person who speaks well writes badly? Do you think that a person who speaks well writes badly? No. Do you think that a person who speaks badly writes well? Do you think a person who speaks badly writes well? No. Okay. So if that's true, then obviously we don't need to focus on writing because writing comes after speaking. So we need to learn to speak well. Okay. So let's go to the next question. What is speech? What is speech? Who can tell me what speech is? What is speaking? Or what is spoken language? What is spoken language? Speech is expressing your thoughts through sound. Very good. Speech is thoughts put into word to express our thoughts. So you're all getting to the issue, right? It's thinking. So speaking is just, verbalizing our thoughts. So let me ask you again, do you think that a person who thinks well speaks badly? Do you think a person who thinks well speaks badly? No. Do you think that a person who thinks badly speaks well? No. So, well, you're going to see lots of examples of how you think badly. Just be patient. We'll see a lot of them on display when we start discussing things. So what you see is there's a set of steps that need to be taken, right? First, we think about things, then we speak about those thoughts, and then we write about that speech. So it's thinking, speaking, and then writing. So when we talk about becoming good writers, if a student who's 17 years old comes to me and says, oh, college is only a year away, I need to learn how to become a good writer. Well, that's not how it works. You can't become a good writer. You can fake it. You can pretend to be a good writer, but good readers won't fall for that. College professors won't fall for that. Audiences, customers and people in the real world won't fall for fake writing. So if you want to learn to become a better writer, you've got to work on becoming a good speaker. And if you want to become a good speaker, you can fake it, but smart people are not going to fall for fake speech. You've got to learn to become a good thinker. So you've got to think rightly, then you've got to learn to speak rightly, and then if you learn to speak rightly, all that writing is writing down what you would speak. And the reason why we write things down is because usually we intend them for people who we can't speak to, right? If your sister is sitting in the room next to you, you don't write her a letter, right? We don't use writing to communicate with people who are present, okay? Was Hitler a good thinker? Well, we have to use the word good in different senses, right? He was definitely an effective thinker. He definitely understood what would motivate German people. He definitely understood how to get people on board with his plans. That's what actually makes him dangerous, right? What makes a bad person dangerous is that they're very good speakers, they're very good thinkers, they're persuasive or deceptive, right? So yeah, a person who's a bad thinker doesn't really influence anybody. A person who's a bad speaker is not going to influence people. A person who's a bad writer, when you take an evil person and you give him the power of good reasoning or deception, that's who becomes dangerous. So yeah, influential people, good and bad, are usually good at these things. It's like having a weapon. You know, you can have a sword and an evil person can use it to do evil and a good person can use it to do good. Speech and writing are the same way. So we've got to work on practicing these things. Just stick with me here, okay? The first thing we've established, this is like the foundation of these meetings. We've got to learn to think well. That comes first. That comes first. As young students, you're just like teenagers, most of you. As teenagers, you can't think well. That's part of the problem that you have with writing, is because you're still learning, you're still studying, you're still gaining experience. There are still so many things you haven't done yet, haven't experienced yet. It makes it very difficult to write because you just don't have enough experience yet. So obviously, when you're 30 years old, you're going to have much more experience, much more knowledge than you have now. And you're naturally going to be able to write better and speak better when you're 30 than when you're 15. So it's just like sports. When you're 12 years old, your body, or let's go even younger, like 10 years old. If you're playing sports and you're 10 years old, your body hasn't even reached puberty yet. You're just like a little kid. You have a little kid's body. You can't really practice sports yet because you're still a kid. When you hit 13, 14 years old, your body starts to change. You get more muscular, you get more energetic, you get stronger. And all of a sudden, playing sports becomes, more of a reality. So when you're younger, you should be learning technique and skills and things like that. And then when you get older, natural strength just comes in. And if you're practiced well in good techniques, and that strength comes in, it makes your performance both skilled and strong. So while you're young, you can't waste your time doing things that aren't appropriate for your age. You've got to know, what should a 15-year-old be working on? What should an 18-year-old be working on? What should a 10-year-old be working on? That's another part of the problem. Many kids are doing things that don't make any sense. You might think you're a writer, but 15 years old, you're not a writer yet. You need to learn to become a thinker first, and that's what we need to work on, all right? So a lot of the time, we're going to spend discussing things, thinking through things, challenging ideas, trying to answer questions, and so on. That's what we're going to spend our time doing. Now, all of you have different interests. All of you are going to have different interests as you grow up. You're going to get into different fields of work. You're going to choose all different kinds of lives, all different kinds of topics and interests. So it's pretty dumb to talk about just, a couple interests or a couple topics. We've got to be able to talk about lots of topics. So usually I'm going to let you choose your own topics for discussion. You'll choose topics you're actually interested in. It doesn't matter what they are. It could be, I used to do this with my students in class. Kids who played sports would talk about sports. Or, girls who were interested in music or dance would talk about music and dance. Boys who were into video games would talk about video games. It didn't matter, because what you need to understand is that Real work in real life is about solving problems. That's what people get paid for. People get paid to solve problems. People become famous because they solve problems. It doesn't matter what kind of work you do. You could be in the military, you're going to need to solve problems. You could be in politics, you're going to need to solve problems. Law, you're going to need to solve problems. Medicine, you're going to need to, no matter what you do, the ultimate test of the best people and everybody else is that some people can solve problems and everybody else can't. So what the ultimate issue is solving problems. Problems can be practical problems, like we don't know how to do something. Problems can also be intellectual problems, like we don't know what the right thing is. We don't know what the answer to a question is. And so we've got to learn to solve problems, but we're all going to work on solving different problems. Obviously, in my life, you see an example of a person who's working to solve problems in education. That's my vocation. I'm constantly studying, thinking, arguing about education. I'm trying to solve problems in education. When you get into your own field, you're going to have different questions, different problems, but all of the method of solving problems is the same. The method of solving problems is the same. The skills that are needed for solving problems are the same. The problems will be different, but the skills are the same. So we're going to try to work on solving problems. Serena says, Dad says the military follow orders. That's right. The soldiers follow orders from the leaders who solve problems. That's the difference, right? The problems are solved by the leaders. The solutions are communicated to the soldiers and they do what they're told. That's exactly how the military works. You've got officers and leaders and you've got soldiers. So the same thing is true in business. You've got business owners and employees, right? You've got political leaders and citizens. That's how society divides. You've got teachers and students, on and on and on. Okay, so the people who are in those influential positions, they are the ones who solve the problems, or they're the ones who are trying to solve the problems. Okay, so again, it doesn't matter what problems you're trying to solve, that's your own business, but how you go about solving the problem is going to be the same. That's often why people who are successful in one area can become successful in another area, because they know how to solve problems. And so they just apply their problem-solving skill to a different area. So people can have multiple things they're working on. Elon Musk is a good modern example of this. He invented PayPal. He helped to invent PayPal and solve a problem about making payments on the internet. And now we see him solving a problem about making cars that don't require gasoline. And then he's working on making rockets that can be reused. So you see, Elon Musk is an example of a modern person who is very good at problem solving, and he applies those skills to different areas of life, different types of problems. Okay, so we're going to get into this quite a bit. So the first thing that I want to talk about is the fact that we argue and reason every day. We argue every day. This is not something we need to learn. It's natural to us because we're rational creatures. We reason and argue and solve problems all day, every day. As long as we're awake, it's just natural. Our soul is constantly doing it. We're constantly solving problems in our mind, even if they're very little things like how much milk should I put in my tea? Constantly solving problems, constantly answering questions. And then what we see is someone answers the question differently and we argue that they follow our solution, right? That they don't use all the sugar or they don't take all the milk. You see how what we do is we solve problems and then we look at other people's solutions and we start arguing about what the solution should be for everybody because it affects us. We do that naturally. It's because we're rational creatures. But the problem is we're also sinful. We're also sinful and we have free will. So we often try to force people to do not what's best, but what we want. So we try to force our will. And that's where we find examples of irrational behavior, where people don't have the solution or have a worse solution, and they try to force it on other people by their will. And this is where we get into rhetoric, where people try to force others to agree with them, even when they don't have solutions. How do we do that? What are some ways we try to force other people to do our will? Give me some examples. What are some ways we try to force people to do our will? Give me some examples. What are some ways we try to force people to do our will? Peer pressure, good. Physically, right? We threaten to, smash you over the head if you don't do what we want. That's good. Overpower them with strength. What are some ways? A bribe. Someone wrote a bribe. That's good. Okay. We try to persuade them financially. Manipulation, yeah, of all different kinds, right? Financial, we could put personal pressure on people. Emotional, right? Like if someone asks you to do something or tells you to do something you don't want to do, you can throw a tantrum or start crying and try to force the person by your emotions, okay? Rhetorically, George would include all of these things, right? So you see what we do, we have all of these different techniques we use to try and force people to do what we want them to do. And many times, those methods are not reasonable. And that's one of the reasons we often need to try to force people, because our arguments are not forceful enough. So one way that you didn't mention is we can actually persuade them to do what we want them to do by giving them good answers or by giving them clear evidence. We can persuade them to exercise their own free will through agreement with us to do what we want them to do because it appears to be best, it appears to be right. That's reasoning. That's one way we can persuade people. Another way is by force, and anything we do to force someone else is called violence. So even like being emotional or crying at someone or getting angry and yelling at someone, anytime you try to force the will of someone else, that's referred to as violence, okay? Different forms of violence, as opposed to persuasion, which is based on reasoning. We can also deceive. None of you mentioned deceiving people. It's common for people to deceive others when they want them to do their will. We can lie about things. That's actually why we lie. We lie because we try to persuade someone to do what we want when we have no good reason and can't persuade them honestly to do what we want. So you see all these different tools, and what I want you to notice is you have used all of these since you were a baby, right? When you were 2 years old, you were already starting to use these means of forcing people, trying to manipulate people, trying to persuade people to do your will. Yeah, torture obviously is another example. Yeah, definitely. I mean, you've never been a parent yet, so you don't know what it's like to have a kid throw a tantrum. It's torture. It is a form of torture. Definitely. So we use all of these things. You have siblings. You use these things with your siblings. You see your siblings use these things with you. And you've got to learn to interpret and understand what's going on, because what do you think should be the only thing that manipulates your will? What should be the only thing that moves your will? What should it be? The only thing that moves your will should be what? God is sort of like the lazy Sunday school answer, right? What should be the only thing that moves your will? And I don't really think God is a good answer, because God respects free will. God doesn't drag us around through life. I would argue that reason should be what ultimately leads you to make your decisions. That's why God made us not only free will, creatures with free will, but reasoning. He made us rational, okay? Rational. How did Adam and Eve fall into sin? They were deceived by the devil. They were deceived. The devil used deception to lead Eve to disobey God. So if Eve had been reasonable, she wouldn't have listened to the devil, but she allowed herself to be deceived because, like Genesis tells us, the serpent was more cunning than the other creatures. He was able to deceive even a rational creature. So we've got all these things to worry about. We've got to learn how to pay attention to how other people are trying to move us. We've got to learn to pay attention to it. This is one of the reasons we study Theophrastus's characters, to become conscious of ways people try to move us and cause us to do their will. We've got to learn to recognize those things and learn how to separate ourselves from that. And everyone will say that they do this, but they don't. Everyone will say, oh yeah, I don't let other people tell me what to do. I'm going to do my own. Baloney, right? Baloney. This happens all the time. People are afraid of peer pressure, all the things you guys mentioned: peer pressure, manipulation, threats, bribery. No one will admit that, you know what, I'm influenced by everybody else. Other people control me. No one will say that, but we are, and we've got to learn how to protect ourselves from it. The most important way is to respect free will, to always remember that we have free will, and that our free will is supposed to be influenced by reason, by truth alone. Our free will exists where? Where does free will actually exist? Who can answer that for me? Talk a little, yeah, in the soul. Good. Now, the problem is that free will doesn't exist in your body, but in your soul. So God made us free, but he didn't make us free physically. He made us free spiritually. So it may be true that if I'm bigger and stronger than you, I can grab you and make you do what I want you to do. You can be controlled physically, but not controlled spiritually. That's what free will really means. The freedom of conscience means you're always really free, even if someone forces you to do something. So what we can control, what we all have control over, is our soul. We have control by free will over our soul, and ultimately, that's what we're responsible for. We don't have control over our body. Police officers can come and grab us and throw us in prison. Our neighbor can, point a gun at us and kill us. We don't have control of our bodies, but we have control of our soul, and we've got to learn to think of ourselves like that. Okay, we've got to learn how to. Well, hypnosis. It's funny you mentioned that. Most of the time, let me ask you this: have you ever learned of anyone who was hypnotized who didn't volunteer and go see a hypnotist? Right? You're not like walking down the street and randomly get hypnotized, right? It's usually there's a hypnotist, he's at like a show in a theater, and people buy tickets and go and volunteer to go on stage, and then they get hypnotized. So I'm not really worried about hypnotism. I've never heard of hypnotizing strangers as they're like walking around. Okay. Let's chill out with the whatabouts. I don't even know what you're talking about. What in the world is a white room? I don't even know what that is. So what we want to do, you see, there's a lot of things we have to figure out and think about. Okay, you've got to think about yourself as an individual soul that's present in a body, and your presence in that body is temporary because you're going to die. Your soul is going to continue to live. You're going to continue to exist even after your body dies. Even if your body is put in prison, your soul is still free. And your soul will always remain free and in your control. And this affects how we think. It affects how we speak, how we argue, how we try to persuade people, and so on. Okay? You've got to learn to think about yourself as a soul with a body. That's why the ancient philosophers said, know thyself, right? Know thyself. So when you get into an argument with someone, you have to learn to separate yourself as a spiritual being, a rational creature. Separate yourself from all of the physical considerations and just deal with the truth. That's the challenge of reasoning. When you see people get angry, when you see people get emotional, when people start to fist fight and all this kind of, you see people who aren't able to separate themselves and have a discussion, right? Soul to soul. So this is the first thing you've got to learn. It's a discipline that you've got to learn, a discipline where you can separate yourself from physical concerns and speak truly, speak reasonably. That will protect you from being deceived or controlled by others. Well, I would say man to man if you understand that it's soul to soul, and you can't control what happens to your body or your money or your house or your friend or your whatever. You can't control those things. And in order to have the calmness that you need to be able to think and reason, and to also discern when other people are trying to force you to do things, you've got to develop this discipline of separating yourself, from physical concerns. So that's why I say there's a lot of other things to think about. If you can't have a discussion without getting angry, it's because you're weak. If you can't have a discussion without getting emotional, it's because you're weak. It's not because you're zealous or you're strong. It's because you're weak. And when people see your emotions or they see you get upset, that reveals your weak. It's like a soldier revealing his weakness, and it actually is the source of how you end up getting deceived in things. So you've got to learn to understand yourself, to separate yourself, to be able to think as if your soul is like a separate person thinking about the situation. And you've got to gain a calmness that allows you to reason and not be influenced by emotion. So there's a lot to work on, a lot to talk about. This is what we study in rhetoric. In reasoning, we obviously talk about how to argue effectively, because we've got to learn how to make convincing arguments. We've got to learn to avoid fallacies, which surround us every day. We've got to be able to identify common fallacies and keep an eye out for them, because they're effective. That's what makes them dangerous. They're persuasive. So we've got a lot to talk about, but really writing is the last of the concerns, because you've got to know to think clearly and speak clearly before you'll ever be able to write clearly. And the good thing is, if you learn to think and speak clearly, really, I should just say think clearly, you'll be able to write essays in just, minutes. You can think of the essay, put it together in your mind, and write it, and write it quickly when you have to. So that's what we're going to work on. So let's get started with a little experiment. Let's try some. So right now, I don't know how much you follow the news, but I'm going to present you with a problem, and I'm going to ask you to think of a solution. Let me describe the problem. So we've got a nation of people called Israel. And pay attention to the details, because the details matter. We've got a nation of people known as Israel, and we've got a nation of people who are known as Palestinians who live in a place called Gaza. And Israel is like it almost encircles this little land of Gaza. Some people in the land of Gaza, who are members of a group called Hamas, chose to attack people in Israel last week, and they did terrible things, killed a bunch of Israelites, really violent, terrible things. And so now Israel has to figure out what to do, right? Hold on, just hold on and listen, okay? So Israel's got to figure out what to do. Now, the problem is that this group of terrorists, these people who did these bad things, they live in this area that's almost inside Israel, and they're in the midst of women and children and people who didn't do it, right? So there are Christians there in this place, and Israel has to figure out what they should do. Israel is angry. Israel wants to just bulldoze the whole place and eliminate the people forever. That would be nice if they could do that. But then they think about the innocent people, and they have to consider whether, obviously they can't just kill the innocent with the wicked. Then the international community, which isn't directly affected by this, is yelling at Israel that they have to be careful not to break any international laws or commit any war crimes. They have to respect the innocent, and so on. So the leaders of Israel are forced to consider what they should do, okay? So my question to you is, what should Israel do? Now, you have to learn how to answer these questions, okay? The first thing you need to do is you need to think about the question, think about the details, think about anything you know that applies to the situation, and you've got to come up with what's called a thesis statement, all right? And I'll type this term in here. A thesis statement. That's your answer to the question, what should they do? Okay? And I can make it even simpler for you. I could say, should Israel invade Gaza or not, right? I can make it simple, give you a yes or no question. But the first thing you've got to figure out, anytime there's a controversial question, you've got to figure out your answer, right? Now, here's the good news. The good news is your answer doesn't need to be right. So all of the stress that comes in when you try to figure out the right answer is not necessary. Your answer doesn't need to be right, because what's going to happen is you're going to start arguing for your answer, and you're going to learn if your answer is strong or not. You're going to learn if your answer is good or not. You may really believe that your answer is right, but as you get into the discussion, you might start to get beat up by other people's arguments, and you realize, man, my idea stinks. I didn't think about that. I didn't think about this, you know? So the good news is when you make a thesis statement, it's like a hypothesis in science. You don't have to worry about it being right. And this is part of what I was talking about before, where you need to learn to separate yourself from your opinions, because your opinion is being put on trial, okay? And if your opinion is bad, if your answer to the question is bad, you shouldn't marry yourself to it emotionally or invest in it and commit to it. You should be willing to let it go if it's bad. And that's why if you enter into it with that attitude, you're not responsible for your answer. You're trying to argue your answer, and you're going to learn from the argument whether your answer is good or not. So there's no stress, okay? So you have to come up with an answer to the question, should Israel invade or not? That's a simple yes or no answer. Once you establish your answer and you choose your thesis statement, now you have to start thinking of reasons why that's right, okay? Why is your answer right? You have to think of positive reasons why your answer is right. Why should Israel invade this land of Gaza? Think of positive reasons. If you say no, they should not, you've got to think of positive reasons. Why should they not invade Gaza? And you can start thinking of them and come up with your best arguments. Now, what's going to happen? You've got two options. You can either sit there by yourself and try to argue back and forth by yourself, which is helpful, but it's also limited because you're arguing with a person who only knows as much as yourself. Or you can throw your arguments into an audience and see what happens, right? And the cool thing about presenting your arguments to an audience is you've got different people of different ages with different experiences, different knowledge, and you get feedback from those people. So when they disagree, you hear arguments you never would have thought of before. You hear stories about examples you never would have thought of before or you didn't know about. And so by establishing your thesis statement, by choosing your answer, thinking of the best arguments you can come up with, and then presenting that to a group, you then get a response from that group, which is very helpful for you. If you lose, if your answer just gets annihilated, if you're separated from your opinion and you're actually judging the opinion, you come out of it better than you went into it, because you now know that that opinion is a bad opinion. It's a bad answer, right? And you can just change to the other answer and know that you've got a stronger answer. And you can now start to put together more arguments for the other answer, which you know is stronger. So when you go into an argument, you have to get out of this ignorant mentality where you're presenting your opinion like it's your baby and you've got to die with it. You see how dumb that is, right? Your opinion is being judged in a discussion. If you write an essay, your opinion is being judged. The danger of writing an essay is that you're presenting your opinion in writing, and if you get annihilated, it's too late. You've already written it. It's public, That's why writing can be dangerous. So discussion is really the place where you hammer out your ideas before you go public with them and make a fool of yourself. That's why this kind of a meeting is good. So what will happen is you'll present your thesis, present some arguments for your thesis, and then you'll get a response. You might find people who can destroy your arguments. They can do that in two ways. And we'll talk about this in detail. One way they can destroy your arguments is to show that things you say are false. Okay? That's one way. You make a statement about something, and someone can demonstrate that that statement is false. Well, if your argument was dependent on that statement, your argument's now garbage, right? That's one way they can prove you wrong. The second way is they can prove that your conclusion doesn't follow from your argument. So your argument isn't valid. It doesn't lead to your conclusion. That's an argument from reasoning, and that can also destroy your argument. So there's two things that others should try to do to you and two things you should try to do to others. Disagreeing doesn't make any sense. Just, what happens often is you'll make an argument and then someone else will just start talking and start sharing their opinion. That doesn't make any sense. That's not how it works. When someone presents an argument, you're paying attention to two things. Statements that they make, are they true or false? That's the first thing. And you can often prove that, right? If you say something like, everybody in Israel thinks that Muslims are evil. Well, now all I've got to do is find a couple people in Israel who don't agree with you, and I prove your statement false, right? So you're listening for statements that people make, and you're questioning whether they're true or false. That's the first thing. And then you're thinking about the whole argument they've made and whether the conclusion really follows from the points that they've made. So two different things you're looking for, two different things that you'll get feedback from an audience on when you discuss your thesis, your answer, okay? Now, if you participate in exercises like that, those exercises are how you learn the answers. You see the difference in thinking about argument as the place where you learn and figure out the answers, rather than thinking about argument as the place where you go to die with your opinions, right? Think about it differently. Argument is where we go to learn the answers by presenting a thesis, making our arguments, and then going through those arguments. So in order to write well, you've got to be able to speak well. In order to speak well, you've got to be able to think well. But where you learn to think, number one, by study, by meditating, by thinking through things, but also by discussing things. And this is the part of society that, especially today, because people don't even study logic in schools, this is where our society, falls apart. Our society doesn't discuss things to learn. Everyone comes into a discussion to try to prove their point, and then what do? They get upset, they get embarrassed, they get angry, they start calling each other names, and because they come to the discussion with their opinions ready to die with them, which is just foolish, The discussion is where we learn. So when you come with your opinion and somebody tears your opinion apart and proves statements you say are false, proves that arguments you make aren't conclusive, if you have a right way of thinking, you should be happy because you are saved from presenting that opinion publicly and being humiliated. And that's the benefit of discussion. So you don't have to be stressed about stating your thesis. You don't have to be stressed about losing an argument unless you get all emotionally attached to your opinion and then you embarrass yourself. So that's why I started talking before about separating yourself from these things, being able to make a statement and really see where it goes. You've heard the phrase devil's advocate, right? You ever heard that phrase, the devil's advocate? Devil's advocate is where you intentionally take up a position that you don't personally believe, right? You take up the opposite case. So for example, if I believe that Israel should just drop a nuclear bomb on Gaza, right? If that's my opinion, it could be my opinion. The devil's advocate position would be to say the opposite. I think that, I think they should not drop a nuclear bomb. That'd be a pretty easy argument. But the devil's advocate is an exercise where you take up the opposite position and just sort of see where it goes. You understand that? You see where it goes. And that's what you've got to learn. You've got to learn that discussion and argument is for the sake of learning what's true. And we use the argument to learn. The argument is where we learn. So If you're opinionated means that you're the kind of person who has a thesis statement, but you like marry yourself to it and are willing to go, down in the flames with it, even if you're humiliated. You've got to learn to separate from your opinions and realize that the answers are put on trial. And in our arguments and discussions, we figure out what the best arguments are. And sometimes what you learn that's most valuable is when you present your arguments, especially in a diverse group. And this is why universities like to have diverse groups. You'll say something like, well, all Muslims believe blah, 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 blah. And there's no Muslims in the group to even object to what you're saying. You can see how that's not a helpful place for that discussion. But when you're in a place where there's 3 Muslims there, and you're going to start talking about Muslims and what they believe and what they do, it's very helpful for the purpose of that discussion to have Muslims there to raise their hand and say, what in the world are you talking about? That's not what Muslims believe, or that's not what Muslims do. So that you can see why a diverse environment for these discussions is helpful, because you get different perspectives, different opinions, different arguments, things you never would have thought of before. You can get that kind of feedback. And if you're the kind of person who's trying to figure out the truth, you want that feedback. You want as much disagreement and, contradictory arguments and evidence as you can possibly receive. One of the reasons being, you'll learn the best arguments against your opinion, and you'll know that those are the enemies that you really need to figure out and fight against if you're committed to your opinion. So you learn the best arguments by doing that, okay? So if we get back to our question, what should Israel do? You can either take it generally like that and try to find a solution, or you can just answer yes or no. Should Israel invade Gaza or not? That's a simpler yes or no question. I'd like you to think of your answer, think of what you would say, and then start to think of why you would say that, okay? Think of why you would say that. Now, the best thing for us to do, and what I used to do with my students in class, was I would assign one student to choose a question, right? That's why I say any topic that interests you, choose a question, a controversial question, think of your answer, and then think of arguments for your answer. And I would ask the student to prepare that and then present it to the group, okay? So you'd have time to prepare, and then when you're ready, you could present it to the group, your answer to the question with your arguments, and then the group would have the opportunity to respond to that, right? So you'd get some questions about your arguments, objections to things you say, and basically you're put on trial with your opinion to try and defend it. And what I used to do in my class, this is what the kids got upset about. I would say, if the class defeats you and you're not able to defend your opinion, you get an F for the assignment. And if you're able to defend your opinion and there's no more objections from the class, then you get an A. So you have a chance to get an F or an A. And the kids would all go crazy because, that's a very risky assessment, especially when it's most of your grade in that class. But what I would tell them is, make sure you choose a question that you can talk about persuasively, right? That's the key. So don't get into a topic that you don't know about. Pick a topic you're comfortable with and that you can talk about persuasively. So what I'd like you to do, today we have our first question, which I've made up for everybody just because it's in the news right now. But I'd like you to think about a topic you're interested in, a controversial question, and I'll give you some examples. And I'd like you to start just sort of jotting notes, thinking, and you can take weeks to do this. It's not something you need to do right now. And whenever you're ready, I want you to let me know. And the following week, when we meet, I'll let you present your question and answer and your arguments. And then we'll open it up to objections. Okay, so we'll do that. We can do it as often as you want. So if you want to come up with lots of questions and go every other week, that's fine. But you're all invited to do that. And the reason why I recommend it is because it's the best way to improve your thinking, is to try to make the strongest arguments you can, subject those arguments to other people's responses and see what happens. Okay. And then just take mental notes, learn from those discussions, learn what mistakes you make, start to learn what your bad habits are, how people beat you up in these discussions. And that's how you actually get stronger in arguing. Okay. So you can think of any topic you want, a question that you're interested in that's controversial. It has to be controversial. People have to disagree on it. And then think of arguments that you would make to prove that your answer is the right answer. And whenever you feel like you've got something you'd like to share, just let me know. And the next week we have our meeting, you can present your question, answer, and arguments to the group, and we'll attack you. Okay, we'll try to beat you in your arguments. And as long as you're thinking about it rightly, you're thinking about it as a way where you voluntarily enter into that discussion to grow, you'll gain from it and benefit from it. Okay. Now, as far as Israel, let me just give you some example topics before we. So, for example, I'll give you topics that kids actually used to choose when I was teaching. I would have an athlete, a kid who plays sports, who would argue whether athletes should be allowed to use steroids or not. Right. So, a kid interested in sports, he wanted to argue about whether athletes should use steroids. I had a girl one time who was disagreeing with her parents about something in her life, and she wanted to argue whether, parents should be allowed to control what their children wear, right? She wanted to argue that parents should not be allowed to tell their children what they can wear. So she did that. Another student wanted to argue whether marijuana should be illegal in America. So they come up with all these different topics, all these different questions, things that were interesting to them personally. And they'd prepare their arguments and they'd have to present it to the class. And then the class would be allowed to respond to them. Okay. Well, now let me just say this, because Lara is judging. What you'll find when you get into these discussions is that the answers are not so simple. That's why they're controversial. Okay. I've had examples where I went into a discussion thinking I knew the right answer, and I had a student prove me wrong. It's just, you can never really be sure. You can never really be sure until you put the arguments to the test and get into them. That's what's important. A lot of the times we think something is clear until we get into it and we realize it's not so clear. For example, the marijuana argument, right? The initial reaction from most people is no, marijuana should be illegal. Well, why? So then you've got to explain why it should be illegal. And you start to give these arguments for why it should be illegal, but everything that you said is also true of cigarettes, and they're not illegal. Everything you said is true of alcohol, and alcohol is not illegal. So all of a sudden the argument gets difficult, right? So if we've got like this chemical, you can even say it's a plant. You can try to make a natural argument. Well, cigarettes are also made out of plants, okay? So all of a sudden you realize that there's a contradiction in the society. How can one thing be illegal for the same reasons that another thing is legal, right? So you see what happens when you get into the arguments, you start to realize like, wow, this really isn't so simple. That's the point of the exercise, right? That's the point of the exercise, because often as soon as something comes out of your mouth, you start to think twice about it when there are other people present, and you realize like, wait, that's really dumb what I just said. Because if that's true, then like cars should be illegal, right? I mean, like I just like made half the things we use illegal by that argument I just made. Okay. So anyway, it's easy to hold your case when you're not actually presenting arguments. So just hang tight. Now, what we'll learn when we do this is usually your first answer, even if you're right, even if your thesis is right, your reasons may not be persuasive. Okay, so you see, there's a lot of lessons to learn. Your answer may be right, but your reasons are wrong. Those are not the reasons. And you've got to learn that by presenting them and getting your reasons beat up, and realize, in order for me to make this argument, I've got to come up with much better reasons than these lazy, dopey reasons that I came up with. There must be more to this. And you'll learn that there is more on almost every subject. And that's how you mature in your thinking. That's how you develop more subtlety in your thinking. That's how you become more persuasive, more reasonable, more clever in your arguments. Because what you'll see in modern society is that people just copy and paste arguments, and the arguments are really dumb because they're never put to a test like this. And when you start putting your arguments to the test, your lazy baby arguments will start to get beat up, and you'll realize, I've got to grow up and get some better arguments. So that's the goal, okay? So any topic that you can come up with, just run it by me first, because I want to make sure it's controversial. And it can't be a topic that everyone agrees with, right? So it's got to be controversial. How old was the student with the marijuana question? Probably like a sophomore in high school, probably like 15 years old. Because that class that I had, Christian Rhetoric, was open to all students. So I had 9th graders and 12th graders together in that class. And sometimes the 9th graders would whoop the 12th graders, and it was very entertaining. So anyway, because remember, we look at it from different perspectives, okay? We look at it from different perspectives. And usually when you're not exercised, your perspective is lazy and incomplete, and other people will challenge it. For example, if you're a kid, you'll argue with an adult, and the adult has things going on in their head that you're not even aware of yet, that affect the situation. So you've got to enter into those arguments. Unfortunately, when you're dealing with like children and parents, your parents don't have time to get into these long extended debates on every single issue that comes up, right? So it's not realistic. That's why you're told to obey your parents. It's temporary, that relationship. You're going to have your independence one day, but while you're dependent on your parents, they have authority over their house. So it's different. Yeah, arguing is good, but at the same time, again, like I said, you're probably not thinking about all the details, especially if you're arguing about rules of the house and things like that. Okay, so good. So the first question I proposed, and it's just an example, is whether Israel should invade Gaza or not. So let's just practice a little. Again, what I want every single one of you to understand is that none of us are presenting answers or opinions as like our own babies that we're going to die for. Don't be stressed about answering a question. Obviously, you want to think of the best answer you can. You don't want to say something ridiculous, but think of the best answer you can, and we see where the discussion goes. That's the benefit of these discussions. We see where things go, and they often go into unexpected places. And those unexpected places become the most important points of the arguments, okay? So who would like to come up with an answer? Should Israel invade Gaza or not? Give me a yes or no. Don't start writing paragraphs and novels, and simple yes or no. Bernadette says no, and she gives us a reason. So let's just deal with Bernadette's first, okay? She gave us an answer. So your thesis would be, no, Israel should not invade Gaza, okay? Now she gives us a reason, because Gaza could fight back and kill a lot of people. So because Gaza could fight back and kill a lot of people, all right? So that's the argument. So some of the people in Gaza attack Israel, commit these terrible things, and then they retreat back into Gaza. The question is, should Israel invade Gaza? The goal would obviously be to what? To punish those people who did those bad things, right? And Bernadette says, no, they should not invade, because if they invade, then the people of Gaza will fight back and a lot of other people will get killed. So I want you to think about that as an argument. So Israel gets attacked. They think about what they should do. They say, we're going to go get those people and punish them. And Bernadette says, no, you can't do that, because if you do that and those bad people or anybody there tries to fight back, you're going to end up killing lots of people. So Israel is told they cannot fight back because other people might die. What do you think about that answer? Now, what I don't want you to present your own opinion. I want you to respond to Bernadette's argument, right? So Bernadette is what's called the respondent. She responded to the question. She gave us an answer and a reason. She was the first one that I saw. So all of our attention is on Bernadette's answer. Don't give your opinion. Don't state another answer. We're looking at her argument, which is that no, people would fight back and then a lot of people would get killed. That's what we're thinking about, okay? So we want to think about that. So Macrina says, I think evil needs to be punished in one way or another. Okay, well, you haven't answered Bernadette's argument, which is that lots of people could end up being killed. Because remember, if we go back to the principle and I ask you for the principle, I say, what did the people of Gaza do that was wrong? What was actually wrong? If your answer is, well, they killed people, well, you're going to kill people, right? So how can the Gazans killing people be wrong, but you killing people be okay? So the first question you've got to ask yourself is, what if you're assuming that the people of Gaza did something bad, what exactly did they do bad? Because if you're lazy and you say, oh well, they killed people, they entered into another country which they don't have permission to enter, and they killed people. Well, that's exactly what Israel's going to do, right? So obviously that can't be the problem. Jacob says Gaza tried to launch missiles back, but Israel shot them down. Well, that's already sort of 2 steps down the road, because the initial attack was the people of Gaza physically entered into Israel and killed people. Macrina says one evil action doesn't justify another evil action. Lara says Israel is defending themselves from another attack. Does Israel have any proof that there's going to be another attack? What if that was the only attack? They don't have, I don't know what proof, protect, I don't know what that means. There's no way of telling whether there will be another attack. Right, so you can't argue that they're defending themselves from another attack because there's no evidence that there even is another attack planned. And you can't use a what if, because you can't go kill somebody because what if, right? You know, if I shoot James and say, well, what if he tried to kill me tomorrow? Obviously, that's not a good argument, right? We can't use what ifs. So you see what's happening. What's happening is it's complicated, right? We have to figure out first what exactly was done. We have to figure out what exactly do we think is wrong about it. And then in light of that, we have to think about what the proper response would be. And we can't commit the same thing and think that it's okay for us, but bad for another guy, right? If somebody comes and kills my daughter, it doesn't make any sense for me to go kill his daughter, right? That's called eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Or maybe that is right. That's the question. So what you see is as you get into these discussions, it gets more complicated, right? We've got to figure out what was actually wrong. What was actually wrong? And you'll rarely hear anybody talk about that, right? What is the actual problem? If you believe in evolution, right? Let's say you believe in evolution. Maybe this is just part of like natural selection. It's just survival of the fittest. So, you know, it's like lions killing deer. Maybe it's good. Maybe it's good for us. It's going to improve the human race. You'd have to first think of what the actual problem is that you're objecting to, and then what the proper response would be. So you see what happened is we got into the discussion without even making any effort to establish what the actual problem is. And we started talking about solutions without clarifying the question, first of all, right? That's one of the benefits. So Serena says, capture the person who did it. Yeah, that sounds nice. That sounds nice in fantasy land, right? But the problem is they're mixed. They're scattered all through the area. They don't even know who did it. And it was hundreds or maybe even thousands of people responsible. So what do you do? Henry says they should ask the Palestinians what they want because they would have to have a reason to do what they did, starting with. So Henry's like, try to figure out why they did that in the first place. Try to figure out why they did that in the first place and maybe find a solution to it. Okay. He says starting a war could hurt innocent people, which would sort of be hypocritical because you're claiming to be upset about innocent people dying, and now you're going to go and cause innocent people to die. That doesn't make any sense, right? So all of a sudden, we've got a controversial issue. Macrina says, find the root of the problem. Yeah, well, that's what you were supposed to do, right? So the problem is it's difficult, right? And you get into the discussion, you start to hear different perspectives, and you realize, like Cecilia just said, it would be kind of hard to find the root of the problem. Yeah, exactly. Now, this is the benefit of the discussion, right? The benefit of the discussion, you see what happens is ignorant people start with a lazy opinion and they start pushing their opinion and they really haven't even thought through the issue. You'll very rarely find people taking the time to define things, first of all, define terms. You'll rarely find people finding laws that are actually being broken. When they talk about people being evil, okay, so what law was broken, right? You will find people won't establish those things first. They'll just jump into the solutions, right? They'll just start jumping into the solutions. That's what you need to learn, okay? You need to learn to pump the brakes, make your thesis, that's fine. Start thinking of arguments, present those arguments, and then what you'll learn as you present those arguments is there's a lot more to think about, right? So now you're getting sent back to the drawing board to think about that question over again. You've already had that first wave of responses, and your second answer is going to be better than your first answer was. And that's how you grow, okay? That's how you get smarter. That's how you get more subtle. That's how you learn to argue more effectively. Now, Bernadette, would you have been happy had you written that in a paper and published it on the internet? Would you be happy to get public response to it? No, right? We don't want public response to our first opinions. We want to have ways that we can discuss these things before we go public. So now I get to go back, I get to revise my thoughts, think more clearly, research, get more information, and try again. That's how argument and discussion is supposed to work. Lara asks, what about cameras capturing evidence? Maybe so, right? Those are the kinds of questions we have to ask. So you just see that this lazy response, right? You know, this lazy initial response. What? They invaded Israel, bombed them, you know, bulldoze it, turned the place into a parking lot. That's what people are saying, you know. You realize how ignorant and ridiculous all that is because you haven't even identified what was actually wrong. What if we dig into it and find out that Israel actually started the problem and this was an effort at self-defense by the people of Gaza? Well, that changes everything, doesn't it? And we haven't even given Gaza a chance to speak before we're throwing nuclear bombs at them. So that's part of the problem, okay? So that's we just had a couple of minutes to work on that. But you see what happened, right? You see what happened. There was an initial thesis statement made by Bernadette, which was good. She said no, right? They should, I think she said no. Yeah, she said no. They shouldn't do that because of this. And then we started to dig into that and respond to it kind of chaotically. We'll probably do this with open microphones in the future with one person at a time talking rather than like the machine gun fire of chats posted. But we see that as we get into this discussion, new questions start to open up. We realize that our first answer was not very carefully thought through, and we're allowed to go back to the drawing board and think a bit of it again. Now, imagine if you have the opportunity to do this hundreds and hundreds of times on hundreds and hundreds of different issues and questions and topics. And then you're applying to college and you're asked to answer a question, and the question is a question you've already had a chance to discuss with other people. That's what makes you suddenly a good writer, right? So, oh, wow, look at This kid wrote this essay. It's all well organized. It's got good arguments. Why is that? Because this student has already had the opportunity to argue and discuss this topic before. They know what the arguments are. They know what the key points are, and they're able to put an essay together that's clear and persuasive in 15 minutes because they've already been arguing these things. That's how you become a good writer, okay? So that's what we need to work on. Okay, so we've got lots of responses and comments and posts here, and you'll see that that's what happens, okay? Everybody's got their own perspective, their own thought, their own view, their own example, their own illustration. That's the benefit of discussing these things in a group. Now, having said that, I've got to wrap this up because we're already over 2 o'clock. That's why it's good for us to have one person choose a question, state a thesis, and present answers at a time. And then we can, in an orderly way, respond to those arguments and help that person come up with a better answer to that question. That's the goal of discussion, okay? So start thinking about questions you'd like to answer. They've got to be controversial. Start thinking about questions you'd like to answer. Start thinking about arguments you'd like to make to support your answer. And then when you're ready, when you feel like you've got a bulletproof case for your thesis statement, let me know and we'll let you present it. You can write it out if you want to, and you can read it in one of our meetings. You can just read it to the group. You could write it out in a Google Doc or something like that and then share the link in our meeting, and then everybody can take a minute to read it. So that's up to you. But I encourage you to take advantage of the opportunity to do this, and you'll see over time that you start getting more mature in your thinking, more experienced, and more subtle. And that's what's going to eventually make you a good writer. But it starts with argument, okay? So yeah, that's all for today. We're already over time. I'll catch you next Friday. At least now you know what to expect and what to prepare for. And if you have any questions about these things, you can contact me anytime, but we'll work on this every Friday. And if we need more time, maybe we'll find more time to do it. Okay, so thanks for coming. I'll catch you guys next week. I'm going to go to my private meeting room. So if any of you have anything you want to work on for office hours, I'm not looking for friends. So I'm not saying come over there and just hang out. I'm saying if you've got any issues in your studies you need to talk about, I'll be in my private meeting room. classicalliberalarts.com/meet WCM. Okay. I'll see you guys next week. Have a good weekend.